and thank you very much for coming to our session, even though Rory Bremley's performing only 200 yards away. I'm sure he's not saying the same about us two right now. My name is Kispal, and this is my colleague Jemma Coulton, and we're here from the National Foundation for Educational Research, which is a leading provider of independent educational research and insights into education. Its aim is to improve outcomes for future generations and to support positive change for education systems. The NFER has 8 key topic areas, one of which is assessment, and Jemma and I both work in the Centre for Assessment at the NFER. The NFER has been producing assessments for about 50 years. Assessments that are statutory and non-statutory, assessments for key stages 1, 2 and 3, in all the curriculum subjects, and its clients include the DFE and other publishers, and some assessments that we produce under our own label. And the one that we're going to talk about today is a Year 6 assessment of reading. Now, in the Centre for Assessment, we've been involved with the National Curriculum Statutory End of Key Stage 2 reading test for about 25 years. In fact, since National Curriculum Assessment became compulsory. And even though we've been involved in it for such a long time, this is the first time that NFER is going to publish a test for Year 6 under its own label. So a little bit first about some of the context to assessment and the context to our own assessment. The purpose of a test is very much dictated by what its outcomes are used for. And for our assessment, there are 3 outcomes. Pupil responses are used to generate summative outcomes. So this is in the form of standardized scores and age-standardized scores. And it's used largely for reporting and accountability. And it's a sort of assessment that's generally done after teaching. But pupil responses can also be used to generate diagnostic outcomes. So this is a sort of assessment that you do to find out what children know and what they don't know, what they can do well, where their problems are. And this sort of assessment is generally conducted before teaching takes place. And then there's a third sort of assessment, which is formative assessment, which builds on the diagnostic forms of assessment, which help teachers, guide teachers to the next steps. So they see where children are, they see where the gaps are, and it gives them guidance on instruction. And this generally happens during instruction. In our work, the diagnostic and formative elements are very closely bound together. So we've unpicked the detail of pupil performance in a diagnostic way in order to inform and highlight the formative implications. So today we're going to talk about the implications for teaching and learning by focusing on how pupils' responses can be interpreted diagnostically and formatively.
Okay, so I'll now outline the process for developing our reading assessments, focusing specifically on the things that we had to do slightly differently in order to arrive at these implications for teaching and learning that Anne has mentioned. So firstly, a little bit more about our reading assessments. There's 2 assessments for Year 6, one for use in the autumn term and one for use in the spring term. The examples we're going to talk about in this presentation are related to the autumn term test, but the development of the spring term test is very similar. So our reading assessments follow the model of the Key Stage 2 National Curriculum Assessments. They have a separate reading and answer booklet, 3 unthemed stimulus texts, and a range of open and closed question formats. So those where pupils have to produce their own written response, and those where they have a selected response. All of the questions are also aligned to the national curriculum so that we can ensure that there's appropriate coverage of that content. And this is an example of part of one of our reading texts from our autumn test, and it's a non-fiction text about an orangutan rescue centre. And some of the examples that we'll see later in the presentation are based on this text. So after developing our assessment and conducting some informal trialling with small groups of pupils, the next step was to conduct a large-scale standardization trial. And this involved trialling the test with a large nationally representative sample of pupils. In this case, around 1,700 pupils saw the assessment. And standardization trials are important because they give an indication of how pupils are going to perform on all the questions on the test. And this allows us to refine our questions and mark schemes, see which questions are working and need to go into the final assessment. But the data also underpins our standardised and age-standardised scores that teachers can use to benchmark their pupils against the national average. So as a result of this trial, we had 1,700 pupil responses to every single question on our assessment, all of which we had to analyse. And this was made more complicated by the fact that we wanted to produce this diagnostic information for teachers. And this meant that we had to gather more information about pupil responses than just what mark they've been allocated. Just marking a response can actually hide a lot of useful information from teachers that could ultimately be helpful to pupils. So in this case, rather than marking, we coded our responses. And this means we categorised the pupil responses depending on the type of answer that was given. And this allowed us to collect information on the correct answers given, the incorrect answers given, and also the strategies that pupils were using. And at the end of the process, we also had information on how well pupils did on the test as a whole. And this meant we could analyse what types of answering were common of different groups of pupils. For example, what strategies were most common in higher attaining pupils. So to try and ensure that this process of analysis was reliable, we trained the people doing our analysis, our coders, to ensure they all had the same understanding of what they were coding for and of the process. We also conducted a lot of checking of our initial analysis, again to ensure consistency, but also so that we could add to and adapt the aspects of answers we were coding for in response to the actual pupil responses we were seeing. I'll now hand over to Anne, who will talk a little bit more about how we think teachers can find this information helpful in the classroom.
So what's the purpose of all this information, and how can teachers use all the information that we teased out from 1,700 pupil answers? Well, it's data from a national sample, so it gives you patterns of performance as a benchmark against which you can compare your own children's performance. And you can do this for yourself, because if you're marking pupils' work over a number of years, especially if you're marking the same assessments over years, you're building up your own bank of knowledge about pupil performance. But teachers who are working perhaps in a low-performing school or a high-performing school may have a skewed view of the norms. And so this gives you a picture of the national norms of performance. And it's quicker than scrutinising your own pupils' answers year after year. Another reason why it's quite useful is because it actually provided us with a very positive picture of pupil performance, and it enables us to give pupils positive feedback on what they're doing. So it showed us a lot about what they can do, and that always provides a very nice starting point from which to build, when you can tell pupils what they're already doing well before pointing out the gaps in their performance. Another thing that we feel it's useful for is that it really does show information about pupils' reading skills, so the different ways in which they're using and responding to different types of texts, different aspects of their reading, as well as, coincidentally, telling us things about their test-taking skills. But it's definitely the reading skills that were highlighted. Of course, all this information helps to set objectives, and it's also useful as a springboard for classroom discussion and classroom activities. And, as well as all that, looking at all this information about patterns of performance, what children do, the way they approach their reading, also helps to build up teacher's own expertise. So we're now going to look at the types of information that we gathered on 3 different question types in our assessment.
So the first question we're going to look at is a 1-mark question, and this is based on the first text in our test, which is a narrative about a boy and his younger sister. And hopefully this is a helpful example, because as teachers, you can probably guess at the answer without having to see the full text. And secondly, it's an example of something that looks quite simple, but actually can produce some interesting and useful diagnostic information. So here we'll be looking at some kinds of answer related to instability. So what did we code for? So for this question, we have 3 different types of coding. Firstly, the content of the answer. So what did the people actually write? Secondly, the strategy. So how did the people approach the question? And finally, for any repetition of the word we were asking about, in this case, we're asking about the term teachering, did people just repeat this in their answer? For example, she was teachering lots, which is something that we did actually see. So what did we find? So just looking generally overall at how difficult the question was, 55% of people got the question correct. And all that really tells you is that it's a mid-range question in terms of difficulty. But we also had all of our additional coding. So what did we find in relation to that? Firstly, looking at the content of answers. So as is probably expected, given the question, the most common responses were related to instability, with 21% of pupils focusing on Mira, the girl in the story's general instability in their headstand, and 22% focusing on instability of her legs. For example, her legs were wobbling around. Now, 12% of pupils didn't explain what teachering meant in terms of movement, but instead explained what it meant in terms of Mira's headstand. For example, her headstand wasn't very good. Moving on to look at the incorrect answers, 10% of pupils repeated the word dangerous, which was actually given in the quotation in the question stem. And unless they developed this answer, just repeating from the question wasn't on its own enough to get credit for the answer. 9% of pupils understood that teetering indicated some kind of movement, but weren't able to correctly interpret that movement. For example, she was dangling. And interestingly, 5% of pupils actually gave the opposite of the correct meaning, saying her headstand was great or her headstand was brilliant. Now in the story, as Mira is teetering and just before she falls over, she says to her brother, "Look, the perfect headstand." And it's likely that pupils that are making this error are taking this statement on face value rather than using the wider context, both of her wobbling around and then falling over, as an indication of actually the headstand not being that good. And this was incidentally most common with the lower attaining pupils in our sample. So now looking at strategy. So only 4% of pupils gave an abstract definition without linking that to the context of the text. Whereas conversely, 42% of pupils gave only a story-specific definition. So these are pupils who didn't define the word teetering, but did define what it meant in the context of this story. For example, it shows you she was struggling to do the headstand, which is correct. And finally, 21% of pupils made more than one correct point. And probably unsurprisingly, this was the higher attaining pupils who did this. And it is something we see fairly commonly when there is more than one answer that's a potential answer to the question, even when, like in this case, we're only asking for one. And finally, and encouragingly, only 1% of pupils in our sample repeated the word teetering without any further development in their answer. And this is low compared to what we would typically expect on a question like this, a vocabulary question, because it's often what pupils fall back on if they don't know the term that we're asking about, is just to repeat it. Like I said earlier, she was teetering lots, which is an answer that we saw. This was given most and more than this by the lower attaining pupils. And actually it should be noted that on the previous slide we talked about the 10% of pupils who repeated the word dangerous from the question stem. And although this is a slightly different error, it does show that these pupils are relying on just repeating from the question rather than going back to the text in order to find their answer. So I'll now hand over back to Anne, who will talk about some of the patterns that we found on our more complicated 3-mark answer questions.
So as well, we analysed all the pupils' responses to every single question and in our assessment. And this is one type of question which is going to be very familiar to you from the end of Key Stage 2 National Curriculum Test. It's a 3-mark extended response question. And it was useful for us to analyse the responses to this, not only because it's part of the National Curriculum Assessment model, but also because it's a precursor to the sorts of work that children will be doing more and more as they go up through education. So these extended response type questions. So what we wondered whether you could spend a moment or two just thinking about is what would be the features of performance that you would be interested in knowing about in pupils' attempts to answer a big, meaty question like this. So you've heard about the sorts of things that we analysed on a 1-mark question, but what are the things that are the interesting features about a big question like this?
What's your neighbour?
Scribble them down. Yes, ponder it on your own.
It says this, so this makes things about that. Because you so that it's specific documents, that's it. But it makes it quite often. It's taught you to addressing the reader directly. So it's not have language.
I don't know why language is it, or whether it's just speak a lot. Yes. So I'm going to tell you first of all the things that we did analyse, and then perhaps there'll be a moment for you to suggest other things that you would have been interested in knowing about. So the first thing we did with the pupils' answers was to actually mark them on the usual national curriculum style mark scheme on a scale of 1 to 3. So that was the first thing. We had to get that out of the way because it's part of the process of developing a good and robust mark scheme. The second thing we looked at and analysed and recorded was pupils' development of their points. And here we were looking at the number of points they wrote and also the degree of their development. So how they developed them, the extent to which they developed them. The third thing we looked at was their answer strategy, the scope of their answer, which isn't the same as the number of points they wrote. And we will be looking at all these in subsequent slides in a little bit more detail. The fourth thing we looked at was the various ways in which they went wrong. So we analysed the ways in which they misinterpreted the requirements of the question. And the final thing we looked at was simply how much they wrote. Was anybody interested in having any other feature of performance quantified? Any other ideas for interesting things that we might have?
Sometimes some children quote directly from text, and sometimes children paraphrase from the text. And I find that's often the difference between those children that are working within the expected and the greater depth. The expected tend to, it says this and this means, and they copy directly a quote, whereas children with greater depth show that they've interpreted it.
Yes.
You know.
Well, actually, that was something we did code for, and we coded for it in the development of points.
Right.
So that you'll see some data on that on the next slide.
And it is interesting that something that we found in the past is that sometimes that's all children will do, so they'll just completely lift an entire section and put it talking.
Yes.
So we did cover this, but actually we found on this particular question they weren't doing that. They were actually trying to paraphrase and write it in their own words. It was something that we did code for, thinking this is often something that happens a lot, but here they were kind of paraphrasing more rather than just lifting directly.
We were wondering whether development points would include their own opinion as a reader, whether they would get any merit for their own response of a reader.
Yes, I don't know that they got merit, but it was definitely something we coded for. What they got merit for was actually using the text, but we will go into that.
And it's testing reading, but would you look at the organisational, whether they realise that the way it was organised?
So we didn't look at that.
persuasive.
No, we didn't look at, because that we would normally regard, I think, as a writing skill. And because this is a reading assessment, we wouldn't normally be looking at their ability to structure their answer.
It's not how they structured it, but whether they saw anything in the text, in the way the text was organised, that would have persuaded
Oh,
them.
yes.
It wasn't just a language or
Yeah, we should have that as a part of
Yes.
the mark scheme. So some of the elements of the text that they were picking up are some were language, some were structure,
And
some
they
were
were all
presentation.
accepted.
Yes, yes, yes. So these were the distribution, it's the distribution of marks in response to that question. Almost 1 in 5 didn't answer the question at all. So they just left it blank. And that didn't take us by surprise, because we know, as do you, that there are some children who simply don't want to engage with a big meaty question like this, so their strategy is just to move on.
Was it near the end of the paper?
It was in the middle. It was in the middle.
The second text.
So they had time to...
Yes.
Yes, and it was the first really big question in the assessment.
Were
that
they all,
came across.
were the big questions all 3 marks, or did you have bigger ones than that as well? Were
No.
there 6 marks? Or
No
3
6
most?
mark one. No, the 3 marker is the chunkiest question in the assessment.
How does that compare with the national? Is that,
For
Do
the
we do-
emission rate,
yeah, do we know in terms of what, when children actually take their end of year 6 SATs tests, does that correlate with that, or do we know that?
I can only say that I imagine it's similar to that, but probably slightly less than 19%, because there's always a difference between a test that's low stakes and high stakes.
Yes.
So a high stakes
Yes,
test
still on
will
the go.
elicit maximum effort, and so
Yes.
children who might tend to omit a question might actually give it a go in a real end of Key Stage 2 national curriculum assessment. What did surprise us by contrast was that almost half of children's answers were considered uncredit worthy, and they got 0 marks, and we will see why in a minute. The distribution of the rest of the marks looked fairly normal to us. 12% of them got 1 mark, 20% 2 marks, and 6% 3 marks. Perhaps all a little bit low because of the large number of children that didn't get any marks. Right, so as you know from the previous slide, one of the things we looked at was the strategy that children adopted in answering the question. So 30% of them, about a third of children, based their answer entirely on a very restricted part of the text. So what they tended to do was to find some fact or aspect of the text and base their whole answer. They latched onto that and they based their whole answer on that one restricted aspect of the text. 16% of them did precisely the opposite. So they seemed to take a step back from the text and gave us a broad-based view of the effect of the text. And another third of pupils did something in between the two. And I don't suppose you're going to be surprised to know that the children who gave us these broader-based views of the text were the abler readers, were the children who scored higher marks on the test overall. Right, now this is the area, the development of points, that generated the most potential feedback for pupils. Once we started unpicking the detail of what children were doing, the implications for teaching and learning just came pouring out of this. And we felt this was really useful, not only for this type of also for future essay writing. One thing we uncovered in analysing children's responses was how many points they wrote in this big question. So as you know, 20% of them didn't give us any answer. About 70% of them addressed a single point in their answer. Another 24%, a quarter of them, went on to try to address 2 separate points, and a minuscule number, I think about 6% of them, went on to address a 3rd point in their answer. And all this data here refers to just that first point. So of those points, 7% were deemed insufficient or invalid. So they weren't sufficiently justified by the text that they read for it to count as a correct point. 11% of them gave us an acceptable point and just left it at that. So they gave us a point, they didn't exemplify it, they didn't justify it, they didn't explore it. 4% of them provided an acceptable point, but the supporting evidence was deemed insufficient, so not sufficiently rooted in the text. But the next one, the 3%, I was a little bit surprised at this. They gave us an acceptable point, and then they imported a quotation from the text and just left it at that. And that was a perfectly good approach. They would have got 2 marks for doing that, for both the acceptable point and the justification. But a more popular strategy was to make an acceptable point and then, in their own words, to explain their evidence for making that point. 5% of them did something more complex than that. They gave us a complex explanation, complex evidence for their point. So that would involve some form of inference or reinterpreting the evidence from the text. But that 5% would still get the same number of marks as the 14% that gave us a simple inference, a simple explanation. What really surprised us the most was the 31% that gave evidence only. So the answers they gave us were counted only as supporting justification. In their own, they didn't provide an acceptable point. So they were rooted in the text, they used the information in the text, but they didn't count as an acceptable point. They were only evidence. So if we look at the next slide. This suggests a lot of useful information that might be imparted to children about what constitutes an acceptable point. An acceptable point is not retrieving or rewording or retelling the information in the text. An acceptable point has to be some sort of abstract generalization about the text. We were very strict about this, not because we wanted to be strict, but because we were using the type of mark scheme that is used in the National Curriculum Assessments. So in the case of this text, the abstract point had to be about the way that the text operates on the reader. And in the mark schemes, this appears in very adult language. So in the mark scheme, it would say something like creates empathy. But in Year 6 language, that would be expressed as it makes you feel sorry for orangutans. And the next one, use of emotive language. Well, a Year 6 way of saying this would be it uses sad words like gloom and doom. So, as you can see, even though it all sounds very sophisticated and very adult, Year 6 children can do this. And at the bottom, I've put an example of a genuine Year 6 answer. A child who's actually able to cover 3 acceptable points in just 2 lines. It makes you sad, it gives you good reasons to help, and is very persuasive in its language. And on the next slide, I've got an example of an answer that got no marks at all, because all of this, which I'm not going to read out, though it was very rooted in the text, and it was taken from the text, it amounted only to evidence and did not make an acceptable point.
So if that previous answer had said, because the text explains to the reader that the orangutans go through it, would that have then been an acceptable
I think
combination?
putting in the word explain or tell or shows would have made it an acceptable point. Yes.
I think in GCSE you would definitely get some marks there because you're giving that, you know, that there is evidence of having attempted to answer the question, as they call that. So I'm surprised to see that got nothing. That's quite harsh.
I know, and I think in the past we will have got some sort of mark because it's so clearly taken from the text. But there is this quite strict rule now that you've got to give some sort of abstract generalisation about the text or in a narrative about the characters. So you'd have to, before giving an example of an action that a character took, you'd need to provide some sort of abstract descriptor of the character, like he's kind, he's a good leader,
I
he's
think
funny.
this is the difficulty that a lot of teachers are having, is that we've moved from reading comprehension being an ability to show that you've understood what you've read, to being an ability to basically be a mini essay writer.
Well, also know how to have, it's really
It's
to know
a
how
sort
to
of-
take the test.
Exactly, it's a
So
test
it's not really a
technique
test
skill,
of your
and
innate
I'd be
intelligence.
interested to just know your thoughts on why we have developed, and this has been something that's really the last 3 or 4 years in the framing of the mark scheme that has required teachers to become teachers of test technique more than comprehension. Is that deliberate because they're looking through to GCSE and the need to be essay writers rather than a focus on reading?
It could also be the quantity of people who are unqualified marking this test.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because I do think a lot of the conventions that have come into place have been put into place because they are they're transparent and easy for markers to follow, and because actually I suppose there is an argument that they're good underlying principles for future ways of responding to literature. I mean, the question which I failed to read out to you was about the text. The question said, how does this text make you want to help? And so
It doesn't actually, why do you feel sorry for them? Actually, why does the text make you feel sorry
Yes.
for them?
Yes.
Because that would be an answer to why do you feel sorry for orangutans, wouldn't it?
Yes, yes. And in fact, when we look at the next slide, we're going to see, is it? Yes, the
But just
misinterpretation
wondering if that gives no
No,
credit
I
for
completely
understanding
agree
it.
with you.
Yeah.
I do completely agree with you, but that is the difference, isn't it? That's saying why does the text do it? Why do you know? Because it makes you feel sorry for, why?
Yes.
Just a couple of words makes all the difference.
It absolutely does. And then you are beginning to think,
And then they tell us how
I'm
to teach
teaching
the test.
test
But then you
techniques.
have some
Yeah, exactly, then they don't.
Yeah.
No, it's a test if you find the right word.
But then choosing the right word is actually important in life as well.
But this isn't the writing test. I think that, we don't have a writing test anymore.
So
Sorry, I don't want to do that.
we did an analysis of the ways in which children went wrong, the mistakes they might have made. And we all know that children come to these tests with an awful lot of knowledge about orangutans, background information, they're experts on orangutans, but only 1% of them actually base their entire answer on their extrinsic knowledge. And that was very gratifying. It did mean that their answers were coming from the text. 6% of them, however, focused their entire answer on the plight of the orangutans. So they became so engaged in what was happening with orangutans and the difficulties they're having that they based their whole answer on their sad plight. And 3% of them did the same thing, but focusing only on the good work of the Orangutan Rescue Centre. So I think, again, this would be information that might be useful in feeding back to children about what they've got to focus on when they're trying to answer these big, meaty questions. And finally, this may seem fairly superficial to you, but we were interested in how much children wrote. They were given 8 lines to write on, and we wanted to know how they used those 8 lines. Well, as we know, 20% of them didn't write anything. About a third of them used up to half the space allowed. 50% of them, roughly, very dutifully used all or almost all of the space they were given. And 4% of them went on to write outside the space allowed, because there did happen to be a space underneath the question, and they filled that as well. And what we discovered in doing the analysis is that writing a lot in response to the questions did not predispose those children to running out of time. So the children that wrote a lot in response to this question continued throughout the assessment writing really long answers to all the questions. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that these are the children that did very well on the assessment and who would be counted as really good readers.
There's two issues there, aren't there? Because you've then got children who find composition and transcription easy and fast, being judged as better readers. Because undoubtedly reading fluency, the fact they can read the whole text quicker, but it does seem to me it is muddling. We're assessing children on their reading ability, and that is setting targets for them for their GCSEs, when actually there's quite a complication of skills that are being pulled into this test.
Yes, it does muddy the waters when you get reading and writing in the same assessment. Yes. But that actually brings us on to the very next slide, where we were looking at pupils' responses to one other type of question, which doesn't depend on writing skills.
So all the questions we've looked at so far, as we've discussed, have been open questions, those where people have to provide their own response. But closed questions like this, for example, multiple choice or matching, can still provide interesting diagnostic information for teachers, particularly about those pupils who may not be attempting all of the open response questions. So in this question, pupils have to identify what this quote tells you about Coulton, the baby orangutan, who's the subject of part of the text. We found that overall, 33% of pupils were able to identify the two correct answers here: enjoyed the climbing frame and was stubborn, and get the mark. The most common incorrect answer was often got stuck on the frame. And this wasn't supported by the text, but it's likely that pupils who didn't go back to the text to support their answer are going for what the most obvious reason is for why somebody might not be coming down from a climbing frame, i.e. not that they're enjoying themselves, but because they're stuck. So that was quite interesting to find out. Another thing that might be veering slightly into the test-taking skills that we've been talking about is the fact that they had to get 2 correct answers for this question. And as is common on this type of question, a large proportion of pupils, here 37%, only ticked one answer. And those pupils who ticked one answer, the vast majority ticked one correct answer, which does indicate that if they had known to go for that second answer or being prompted, they would have been able to get that second answer correct. And here it was stubborn, which was the one that was gone for less, probably because it requires a little bit more inference about the character of Coulton in the story.
So we've seen this slide before, and I'm not going to go back through it again. But I'm hoping that you're going to agree that when you have the patterns of performance based on a national sample, it gives you a sort of yardstick against which to compare your own pupils' performance. And so you know when certain points are likely to crop up again and are worthy of your attention to focus on in class. And you can also spot features of performance that may just be an aberrant blip in your own pupil's performance, and you know you don't have to waste time on that. So you can see the big picture that lies behind your own pupil's individual performance. And finally, what conclusions did we draw from this? Well, it reinforced to us that assessments, even summative type assessments, can produce an awful lot of formative information. And this formative information is formative for us as researchers and for teachers, as well as providing formative feedback to pupils. The other thing we realised in looking into all this was that the implications we were deriving didn't apply only to the least able readers. To actually apply across the board, we found out things about good readers as well as all the others. Unfortunately, one final message is that any form of formative assessment requires an investment of time, because it takes time to compare your own pupils against the detailed analysis that we offer in a test like this, or that you do yourselves. But the time is very well invested. Thank you very much.